All right, guys, welcome to another episode of Wisdom and Wealth. I'm sitting here with Alycia Mondavi, which is kind of a big deal. And I got to give you a little backstory, right? Because we met at a friend's house, the Parks family, and did a wine tasting. And it was totally, I thought we were just coming over to hang out with some friends. I had no idea what we were coming over into. And ended up being this awesome tasting with Alicia's and her sister's new line. But we had a great time, but I got to hear Alicia's story, and so invited her to be on, and I'm thankful and she came on. So Alycia, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me, Corey. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, heck yeah. Well, it was awesome, but if you don't mind, what I'd love is to get in, and I even saw you're an equestrian, right? I was raised around horses. My dad's a vet, and so
I love
like,
it.
before we jump into all this stuff, but I want to get to as much as we can. But if you wouldn't mind, like, give me a little background story, some of the stuff that you even shared that night, where you came, your family has developed this Napa name and namesake, an awesome place, and an incredible legacy. What's the history before coming to you, before you created?
So as you mentioned, it's been in the family for quite some time. We're actually nearing about 110 years. And the family got into the industry purely by accident. I must preface, though, that the generations before my generation, so third and second and even first, left very large shoes to fill. So it's our job as fourth generation to make sure we keep things going, and for another 100 years at minimum. But yeah, our story is it's a fun one. It's Italian family. My great-grandparents made the move from northern central Italy, a little town called Sassoferrato, and they made the move to Virginia, Minnesota, of all places. They ended up in an iron mining community, and very quickly my great-grandfather Cesare decided he needed to get out of the mines. Ended up buying the local grocery store, and what he never anticipated were all the locals came and knocked on the grocer's door to source their grapes to make their household wines. So he was sourcing produce from all over the U.S., and he was like, I can add grapes to the trucks, no problem. And he began sourcing fruit from California, and eventually had the opportunity to pick up his entire family, relocate them to California. And in 1943, they had the opportunity to acquire the Charles Krug estate, which oldest winery in Napa Valley. And granted, this was post-prohibition that they got this opportunity, but it was 147 acres that they scraped together every penny that they had to purchase it, $75,000. So, yeah, it's
In 1947.
in 1940,
75,000.
1943 for
Three, excuse me.
75,000. Yeah, and now we're averaging anywhere from $500,000 to $1.5 million an acre in our valley. So, yeah, I'm very fortunate. My grandfather had the vision and foresight to purchase and acquire land early on. So he got aggressive in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Never once wanted to spend more than $1,000 an acre. And he accomplished that. He had secured a little over 1,000 acres, and ultimately there was the family feud. So we are case studies on how not to operate as a family business. And there's books that's been written about us. And as I always preface, like, never believe everything you read. And there's always three sides to every story: your side, their side, and then the truth.
The truth, right?
Yeah, but that being said, the family did go through a pretty significant split up, and my side of the family, my grandfather Peter Mondavi Sr., who was Robert's younger brother, ended up with the Charles Krug estate, and so we're fortunate we're still family owned and operated, with fifth generation running around at 3.5, and my cousins just had a son as well, and he's approaching about 6 months now. So we at least have next generation on the ground.
Come on.
Yep.
So that makes you aunt, right? You're
Yes.
aunt. Yes.
I'm Auntie Tia, Auntie
Auntie Tia.
Tish. Yep. So yeah, it's fun.
We'll going through that. So how's it, I guess, what was the big battle? Was it just a family feud where, like, hey, we got into it?
Yeah.
Like,
Unfortunately,
this is mine, not yours, or what's?
more or less. I mean, it is a little bit more complicated than that, but the goal of my great grandparents, Rosa and Cesare Mondavi, was that when they acquired the winery, Charles Krug, they wanted the two sons to own and operate it someday. They did have two daughters, but back then the women were meant to be in the kitchen and stay at home. So they were not involved, but the goal was that it would be owned and operated by Robert and Peter. And that only lasted for a handful of years before that infamous family feud. So unfortunately, I wish that they could have figured out how to make it work, because they would have been a powerhouse if they had been able to make it work together. You had one brother that was focused and fixated on quality, and another brother that was fixated and focused on quantity, and very different approaches to the table. And when two very opposing minds collide, it's fireworks at the end. So it actually did go to court. It set precedents. It is still case law that is being taught at Harvard Law School. So it was actually ruled in favor of Robert Mondavi as a minority shareholder. And as part of the split, it's 30 days of court hearing. My father was actually only 21 and his brother was 17. And my dad sat through every day of the court hearing, and he said it was pretty brutal. What should have been, as the family thought, slam dunk, it ended up not aligning with my grandfather. But they came to an agreement, and that required my grandfather relinquishing the 500 acres of Tokelon, but that allowed Robert to start his winery, Robert Mondavi, and he opened his doors in the 60s. And while he was a powerhouse marketing genius, he was busy putting Napa Valley on the map and making Mondavi the name it is today. My grandfather was the innovator of the two, and stayed in the cellar. He was the winemaker. He developed cold fermentation and cold stabilization. He, along with a buddy and vintner in Sonoma County, were the first to introduce French oak barrels to the U.S. He was also the first to plant Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Carneros, and introduced Chenin Blanc to California. So he was very quiet and a man of few words, but which was the opposite of his brother Robert. But like I said, you had a marketing genius, and then you had a winemaker, innovator, the two, and they sadly couldn't make it work. But it also simplified the family dynamics, though, in all honesty, because there would have been about 15 of us in the fourth generation if we had stuck together. So now there's two families that are involved, Mondavi facets that are involved with Charles Krug, and then Robert's. Sadly, my cousins did have to sell Robert Mondavi Winery in 2004. So that is corporately owned, no longer has any family business relations behind that brand. But we were able to keep our project still going, the Charles Krug estate. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so talk about that. Like, so obviously you shared that story plenty, right? But you looking back on this, like what does this whole thing communicated to you, or like even come down from your family as a way to operate? Like when it comes, like with your sisters now, right? Like how do we make sure that we, and we can get real, so where we can get real down into the weeds about like the business aspect of it. But what's the lessons and the main things that you took away from that is to make sure you guys operate appropriately going forward.
Right. Well, right now I should preface, we do have an outside board that assists in running, and it does have my father just stepped off. He's trying to retire and hand the reins over, which is that's a new concept for my family, because my grandfather we lost at 101 only 8 years ago. He went into work every single day up until 2 weeks before he passed away, and he was still president of the company. So, so handing reins over is a hard one for our family to chew. Even the first generation was challenged with doing it. Second generation definitely challenged in doing it, and third generation, honestly, as they lead and oversee the operations and have seats on the board, but it is we did a generational skip. My grandfather did, so technically he bypassed his two sons and gifted everything down to the sisters and our two cousins.
Keep the trust.
Yes, exactly, and that helped us not only keep the business in in check, but also make sure that we had no other issues or arguments between the next generation that could cause another divide. So grandpa kind of put in some guardrails to ensure that didn't happen. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. What is that like for you guys today?
Excuse me.
To making sure, hey, just because like I love my family, right? But there's still certain ways that we have to walk through is doing business together.
Yeah.
And because and we get stories like this all the time, right? Whereas, we had a situation with a guy who sold off a big piece of land, and private equity firm come and bought it, and it was made a great chunk, and wanted to pay off his kids' houses and do all these cool things, and did those, right? Well, one son, I remember we were dealing with this. I go, okay, if we're going to do this, we have to do it appropriately. Write a note back to the trust and have it a representative portion of their inheritance. Something happens to you. And he goes, okay, you explain it. And, one son was no problem. Whatever I got to do for dad.
Right.
It's not mine.
Yeah.
And the other guy was, I don't like this.
Right.
I don't want to do any of this.
Right.
I go, well, if you want this $1 million home paid off, you will do this.
Right. Exactly.
Otherwise, you're reaching different problems. So, like, you see the dynamics with people coming into these situations where this, right? Like we kind of reach a certain level of success or wealth or whatever people want to view us as, and the hands come out.
Yep.
Real easy.
Yep. They're the first things that come out, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and now rightfully so, like, you got to judge, why are you talking to me?
Yeah, exactly.
What are you trying to get at?
Yeah.
And so, but you see really fast that money ends up becoming a megaphone for something. It's a blaster for something you already are.
Right.
So you're a big giver. If you're a giver before you had money, you'll be a big giver with money. If you're a jerk, you're a bigger jerk with money. And so, that's why, it's necessary to walk through these pieces. But like knowing that, even though we believe some of these relationships would never go south, they just do sometimes.
Exactly. And to answer your question, I think my sisters and I have been very fortunate. We launched the Mondavi Sisters collection 19 years ago. And I do joke and say mom and dad unintentionally raised an executive team. We managed to have every department head covered between my three sisters and myself. Oldest sister Angelina is our winemaker. I manage the brands. I gave myself fancy title CEO, but it's glorified for I run everything because we're a one-person show. No employees under us or under me. And then my sister number 3, we do go by numbers sometimes. But sister number 3, Brianna, she has been in her forte is sales and works full-time for C. Mondavi and family. And they just actually about a year and a half ago moved her into our hospitality department. And she now oversees the direct-to-consumer and luxury experience at our family's estate. And then the youngest sister is still our black sheep, works in finance, lives in Denver, and she's loving every minute of it. And every other day, I'm offering her a job, and every other day she reminds me I can't afford her. And I'm like, okay, well, you got a seat next to me when you're ready. And so I was like, and back to a comment I made earlier, she's doing a dang good job networking and very good at it, naturally good at it. So I think leveraging our strengths has made it possible for us to work together and have a very symbiotic relationship, and we don't step on each other's toes. I don't make any decisions without running it by the entire family, including mom and dad. They own one of the properties that we source our fruit from for our Dark Matter Cabernet. And so I always, when I get a crazy idea, text the group, and we're on a group text thread, and there's going to be probably over 100 mixed texts after this podcast, but we're thick as thieves. We're inseparable. If you're going after one, you've got a whole herd behind
that's what I'm talking about.
We don't get put in the corner very often because of the fact that you're fighting all 4 of us. So I do think that leveraging our strengths and just knowing where each of us are strongest and where we can provide the most benefit and be the most effective for the company has allowed us to keep running things as is. And as for the family corporation, and I'm guilty of not following this advice, but if you can leave emotions off the table, you get a lot more done. And it's once you start throwing emotions around is when you start hitting those speed bumps and hurdles, and you kind of lose all sense of logic and sound reasoning. And so if you can leave the emotions off the table, you're in a much better spot for any family discussions.
We took this from our pastor. It's a sign of maturity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, sometimes it's from experience where you've been burned or you
Correct.
burned yourself, but also from somebody else's. Your ability to respond appropriately or non-emotionally is a maturity sign.
Absolutely.
Right?
And I think that that's the one piece of advice I always tell when I'm speaking at family business conferences and in front of an audience, and everybody always asks, what's the secret to success? And like I said, I'm guilty of not adhering to my own advice always. And it's constant work in progress. And by default, my sisters and I are madly in love with the industry and our estate and have memories. We grew up on that property. We're basically, the Charles Krug estate had 3 family homes on it, so it was our family compound. We had mom and dad raised my 3 sisters and I in one home, and grandma and grandpa lived in the middle home, and my aunt and uncle raised their 2 kids in the 3rd home. So all within about a 300-yard distance from each other. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. So we grew up, rolled out of bed, and we're in our backyard playing, and that included the vineyards and the winery and everything in between.
Well, okay, so selfish question now.
Yes.
So you talk about thick as thieves and having each other's back. My brother and I went on a cruise one time. This guy was just drunk, crazy, and like looking at my brother nuts like he wanted to fight. And it was really weird bipolar situation, right? And I remember I'm in between this guy, him looking across the table at my brother like he's like, you want to fight? You got a problem? And I remember him talking across me, and I just look over. I'm like, do you realize we're brothers right now? Like, if you fight him, you're fighting me. And so, okay, selfishly, so you got a story. I love, like, if you had some, because, like, listen, we love to have up here, but give me the down here where this is real right now.
Yeah,
I want to hear something where you punch this other girl.
I'm number 2 in the lineup. I swear to God, there is something about birth orders.
Yeah.
You've got
me too.
I'm
middle.
Are you? Yeah. So you have my older sister who, if you don't want anything to get back to mom and dad, don't tell Angelina. And like a speeding ticket, for example, mom and dad will find out in 2 minutes whether you've been pulled over. And it's like, I heard you got a speeding ticket. I'm like, Angelina. I was like, you weren't supposed to tell mom that or dad that. But anyways, so it's just kind of given. If you tell one sister or mom or dad, the whole family is gonna know. It's just we relay the messages very quickly. But they call me the pit bull of the family. So all
right.
I've definitely been in situations where my sister mouthed off to somebody, stepped out, and I happened to be the one receiving the fist, and I was like, oh no, wrong decision. I'm just like, okay, this is fun. And so anyways, I'm the one, my sisters are like, they might start the fight, and I'm the one that finishes it. But they also know I took boxing. That's like, for me, is a huge stress relief and a fabulous form of exercise. And so they also know I can hold my own. I'm 5'0", but I do have a bite, I guess.
You got an upward reach.
Yeah. So there's plenty of stories. So it is, like I said, if you go after one, you're kind of getting the whole herd behind. So
I love that though.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people. I got into it with a buddy the other day over something in his marriage is struggling, and I'm like, I think there's not a lot of people who are all or nothing, and they draw lines, and like it's not like we got a lot of gray in this world, but there's some things where I'm like, draw a line in the sand. Yeah. Right. I'm like, are we willing to die for this thing or not? Right. And it's relationships. It could be about one thing in particular, but it's and that was something we got into about that was with him. But I love that because the same things. I'm like, we got those people where, like, I don't say, we go extreme. Like, you kill somebody, I hope you bury the body, right? And we're going to cover this thing up. I'll go die in the grave with you. But I think there's so many people that are either too afraid or maybe just haven't become convicted enough to be willing to draw a line in that sand, that they lose a lot of value that comes from that.
Yeah.
Right. And it's that those relationships, those from your sisters or anybody else, where I'm like, I got buddies I haven't talked to in years. I come back and I can talk to them, and I'm like, guys, Teresa family in New Jersey, these are talking about Italians, and saw the way how this guy treated his wife and his kids and how they looked at him. And I remember leaving a voicemail. I'm like, you were an example before we had kids of the guy, of a huge example of a guy I wanted to be like.
Wow.
And we don't talk that much, but I don't care, because that's what that guy means to me. Right. And anyways, I just appreciate that. But like, what, was that a line drawn in the sand for you and your sisters, or how did you guys even come to that place, or did that naturally form, or was there definitive moments?
It was pretty natural. Like I said, I think there is something to the birth orders and personalities and temperaments. My sister Rihanna is just very even keeled. Nothing phases her. I'm a little more tightly wound, a little bit more short tempered. So it's so like when I know if I need to, I'm like, okay, before I respond to something or react to something, and if I need a sound check, I go to Rihanna, and and it's just kind of been that way our whole lives. And then if I've got more corporate based questions, I'll go to the youngest sister, Gigi, who is of all of us, she's worked and stayed in the same corporation for 12 years, but global corporation, Massachusetts Financial Services, and they are known for their culture. So she's a good sounding board for having those corporate discussions, and how would this be handled in a corporate setting? Although we're a family business, there are some corporate values that we want to make sure we adhere to and apply to our own businesses. So it was kind of a natural process, and then it wasn't until probably about 5 years ago that I started recognizing, because everybody kept asking, why does this work? How are you guys able to work together? And it dawned on me. I was like, it's because we've kind of found different avenues and have stayed in our lanes, but also support each other in each of those avenues. So Angelina hands everything to me in shiners, and then after it gets bottled and put in the wine, corked and bottled and put into the case, then it sits in shiners for a couple years, and then I jump in and take over from there and handle all of our customer relations. And our Rihanna just took over our fulfillment process as well. So that's always a challenge in the wine industry, is navigating fulfillment. So she took over that, and she's good at it. So I was like, I needed help, and she goes, let me take something off your hands, and she goes, let me work on fulfillment. So we do have regular check-ins, just mentally, like, where are you at, how are you doing, and that was all kind of a natural progression. And then once we started recognizing what we had established, we're leaning hard into it, because I think that's what makes it work and tick. And that's also what we want to apply to the family business model as well.
Okay.
So,
well, walk through that a little bit. So let's, practically speaking, like, what is there behaviors that you guys walk through to make sure that you're checking boxes, to make sure that, like, hey, we got to have these things that keep us effective, to keep us, moving the needle forward, that we need to do instead of it. A lot of businesses get lost in conversation, right? And so, practically, what are some things, I guess, you guys do behaviorally that are working for you, that have been really good tools?
Yeah, I've been fortunate. I turned 40 this year, and I've witnessed 4 different CEOs in the last about 12 years in our company. which obviously you don't want that kind of turnover. You want some more consistency, but there was a lot of learning, not only for myself, but even my father and my uncle is also, and figuring out what the corporation needed and what kind of leader they needed. We did know that we wanted to put an executive team in place that was non-family members, just so that there was no bias towards one side of the family or the other. That's helped us quite a bit, just kind of keep everybody appeased, and the next generation, we're all at very different levels and have very different, I guess, goals in mind. We all have the same end goal of making sure that the family business stays in the family for another 100 years plus. Just how to get there is what we're currently navigating as a fourth generation, and what that looks like. My two cousins are first cousins. They're still fairly young, early 30s. And so they're a good 10 years behind my sisters and I of being involved in the industry. So they're trying to figure out what steps. Brilliant kids. They won Harvard and Princeton graduate, and then the other one is Stanford, MIT, and a graduate as well. And so we've got book smarts on one side of the family, and then I joke and say my sisters and I got the street smarts. Right? We didn't get quite those book smarts, but street smarts has carried us a long way. It's allowed us to shake hands with a lot of people and experience the world and sell wine all over the world as well, and partake in some of the best nonprofit events globally, assist in raising money for our community. And I think single-handedly, my sisters and I, over the last it's probably the last 10 years, we've helped bring over 13 million down to our community alone.
Wow.
So things like that is, I think, helps us kind of keep everything together and make sure we have a philanthropic level that's very strong, because that's what we full-heartedly believe in, is helping others that are less fortunate. And whether that's cancer or education or mental health, you name it, we try to align ourselves with organizations that are making an impact and stuff.
Does that come from something? Like, has cancer hit you guys?
Cancer, obviously, having a personal connection with cancer. Cancer does run, I think every one of us has a touch point, or knows somebody that's been affected by it. So cancer is a huge one. And then the rest are, quite honestly, are major factors that the next generation or the kids, the youngins, are battling and dealing with. And we everybody looked at us as the next generation and the future of Napa Valley, and they're still watching us and saying, you guys are the future of Napa Valley. We're watching you. But there's a whole another generation of kids that are being brought up, and my nephew being one of them, where we want to make sure that they start things out on the right foot, and those that don't have the same opportunity as my nephew does, we need to help them. And so my mother grew up in a fairly poor farming family, very cut from a different cloth than my dad was, who's the Mondavi. And so I think a lot of it, the generosity, has kind of been taught and passed down from my mother, is you've got to help those around you.
I feel that, because we've had cancer hit our family pretty hard, and but we've also seen some pretty amazing, I want to say, revival from that. My brother lost his son. Him and his wife lost their son. But through that, scared to death, they ended up having twin girls.
Oh, wow.
And so we've seen some pretty amazing stuff come from that. Doesn't take away from the sadness at all, right? But also a different heart and chest that comes into your life. Right? And that's where I can't remember how to frame this exactly, but someone had talked about, you can tell somebody's intentions basically by how much hurt they've had in their life. A lot of times. Sometimes we can put up a more selfish guard up for that, but other times it just opens you up like crazy too. And so that was something I appreciated about what happened with them, is they opened up about Evan, their son, and God totally radically grabbed me with. And thankful for that, because it gave so much more depth to the relationships that we have right now.
Completely.
You know?
Yeah, that's actually one reason my sisters and I launched our new brand, Humble Beginnings. We wanted to honor the humble journey that we all share. They're all different paths and different avenues, and we have very, very differing stories from person to person. But I think we've gotten a little carried away with all the details and the chaos in the world, and we've forgotten where we all started. And so we share this beautiful journey through life, and as I mentioned, very different paths throughout. But like the wine, we're like, we have to remember the wine starts in the dirt. And we've kind of gotten a little carried away and deviated quite a bit from that messaging. But that is one reason why we wanted the Humble Beginnings to launch that brand, and then also lean into it being a brand that we can support a lot of nonprofits on as we grow it.
We'll talk about that. What's Humble Beginnings?
Humble Beginnings, yeah. Humble Beginnings is a Pinot Noir and Chardonnay from Russian River. We only produced 150 cases of each this year, so tiny production. We're gradually growing it. And we also have a Napa Cab as well. Our Aloft Dark Matter brands are in that luxury tier point. We wanted to introduce something. We're like, well, we know winemaking, and that's one thing our family knows how to do is make wine. But so we wanted to lean into let's focus on the juice, let's focus on the quality, let's take things back to the basics, not get carried away with packaging. It's actually a bottle without a front label, so there's no label entirely on the front. Government already signed off on it, TTB, because our industry's gone, how did you get away with that? And we're like, I paralegaled for 8 years, and you kind of read.
None your business.
You read laws differently, and my job as a paralegal is to skin a contract 10 different ways. And so I read the legality, and my sisters and I are like, well, why don't we just scrap the label? It's like less carbon footprint. It's taking it back to the basics. Let's focus on what's in the bottle, not on everything outside of it and the fluff that makes it beautiful. But so we decided that that's what we wanted to do. So, but it's also priced a little bit more friendly than our Aloft Dark Matter brands are. So, meant to be a little bit more accessible to all. Yeah.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah.
We'll switch to Dark Matter for a second.
Yes.
Because I'm like, delicious. This is what we had the night of the tasting.
Yes, correct.
The Zinfandel was my favorite.
Yeah.
But how did this show up?
So our Dark Matter Zinfandel, this was our very first brand my sisters and I cut our teeth on in 2005. We actually bought our first property in 2003. My grandfather had we had just sold actually a couple acre parcel to a neighbor of ours that wanted to square off his property, and he had been bugging us for years, and we finally said, okay, sure. My family doesn't sell land at all, but there's been a couple times where if you've got a challenging neighbor or you have a neighbor that's really trying to square off his property and they're good neighbors, you're like, okay, fine. Yeah. So we had sold off a couple acres, and to avoid some taxes, we did a 1031 exchange. My sisters and I rolled that into our first 4-acre parcel up on Howell Mountain, which was kind of a new beast for our family. They had never worked with mountain fruit before, and my parents a couple years prior had bought the very first property on Howell Mountain that now goes into our Dark Matter Cabernet. But we as sisters ended up buying just about 1.5 miles down the road from my parents' house our own 4-acre parcel, and it was poorly maintained, kind of part of an ugly divorce, so it wasn't touched for quite some time. So when we bought the property, one of the big questions was, do we rehab this vineyard and keep the Zinfandel, see what it produces in a couple years, and see what we have to work with, or do we rip it out and replant to Cabernet, because Cabernet is king in Napa County. So fortunately, my sisters and I, because we are fiercely independent and want to go a little against the grain of things, we decided to keep the vineyard, rehab it, which meant we cut fruit on the ground for the first 2 years. And we got our first harvest in 2005. We only got enough for 20 cases. So we did a very, very tiny release. And then the next year we got our first official vintage, which was about 120 cases worth. And if we're lucky, yucky. Zinfandel's very volatile grape to grow. It's thin-skinned, and your clusters are very big. The berries are quite large themselves, thin-skinned, so they don't love extreme heat. They don't love a lot of rain. It is so finicky that most vintners don't grow it anymore in Napa Valley. You can kind of put a little more pressure on the Cabernet fruit than you can the Zin fruit. So, but in one cluster you'll have green berries, you'll have shriveled berries and raisins, and then you'll have perfect berries. And so, fortunately, we have this brilliant machine that we adopted from the blueberry industry called the optical sorter.
Okay.
So what used to be sorted by hand only a handful of years ago is now goes through a machine that's got a visual X-ray, and literally you can dial it into size of the berries, color of the berries. It kicks out all the stem, any greenness. You can equate for, if you want 15% shriveled berries or more ripe berries, you can equate for that. If you only want it to be 5% shriveled berries, you can equate for that. Or if you don't want any, it's set it to 0 and all you're getting is perfect berries at the end. So that you can dial it in pretty accurately, and it's pretty impressive. So that being said, we had our first property, and my sisters and I wanted to do things, shake up the industry. We were all under the age of 21. Actually, my oldest sister, Angelina, our winemaker, had just turned 21, and when we launched the brand, but she was the only one of legal drinking age. I don't know if that was technically legal, but it was. I guess it's a moot point now. We're 20 years down the road already, so it's all said and done. But anyhow, we launched our first brand, and we wanted to put a skull on the label, shake things up, kind of add a little edge to the industry, because we thought it was
Metal. I like metal, so I'm like,
yeah. So it was one of those, we intentionally wanted to push the boundaries, and we push the boundaries with the winemaking. So we do extended barrel aging, 4 years new French oak, 2.5 years in bottle before we even consider releasing it. And of course, TTB, who approves our wine labels in our industry, they denied the label design initially. And me, being the paralegal, I'm like, why? And I needed a reason. I just not a no. It doesn't. I was like, let me go back to the table and figure out how we can make this work. And anyways, the response was, well, skulls and crossbones are the universal sign for poison and death.
Oh,
and
yeah. Okay.
So, of course, my response was, well, there's no crossbones. And we got it stamped and signed off a week later. So officially the first bottle of alcohol to actually have a skull on it.
Is it really?
We even beat the spirits company to the table as well. Crystal Head came around about 2008. Yeah, and we were tiny. I mean, we're still quite tiny, but it was fun. All of our mentors, believe it or not, mom and dad go, maybe you should circle the design to your mentors and see what kind of response you get. Sure enough, every single one of them said, don't do it. So when you get don't do it, and you get 4 girls that are fiercely independent, out of pure
tell me what not to do.
Out of pure defiance, we're like, sounds like we're doing it. So that's why that Humble Beginnings label has also been really fun, because it has no front label, and the whole industry's like, what are you girls doing? We accept cryptocurrency, first winery in the Northern Hemisphere.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I missed Southern Hemisphere by a month. Somebody else snagged that. But no, we do things. And of course, I'm talking to all of our governing agencies to make sure we can accept cryptocurrency. They're like, I'm sorry, what do you want to do? This is in 2020. And I said, I want to accept cryptocurrency in form of payment for wine. And they're like, we're going to have to turf you to legal counsel. And I was like, okay, sounds good. So then here I am, before I know it, ABC and TTB, I'm talking to legal counsel on what cryptocurrency is and how it can be utilized in the wine industry. And they all, I guarantee they were scratching their heads sideways, still trying to figure out what crypto even was. I know that they have a better sense now, but in the grand scheme of the hours spent talking to counsel and educating them, ultimately it came back that they can't regulate what form of payment we collect. So they can regulate what goes on the label, they can regulate your licenses that collect your taxes, but they can't tell you what form of payment. So their counsel said, you're good to go. And I was like, put that in writing.
Yeah.
Because the last thing I wanted to do is put my sisters and I in jail or do something that was like not kosher with or legal in our industry. And that's how I led all the conversations. I want to do this, but I want to make sure we don't get in trouble for it. So I did my homework, went down the rabbit hole, and then that was actually, funny enough, the easy part. Then the hard part came. What platforms actually accept cryptocurrency in the wine industry? None.
Yeah, I was gonna say, probably none.
I built everything out in the back end, taught myself. I guess sitting at home during COVID, I got bored.
Had some time.
I had a little bit more time, but actually not even that much time because everybody drank 20% more in
a
wine
lot
and
more.
sales went up and yeah, and so it's starting to correct itself. But yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.